Welcome to The Big Picture, a show that takes a deep dive into the political landscape of not only America, but right here in our own backyard of Illinois.
It's showtime, folks.
The Big Picture is on WCPT 820. And now, here's your host, Edwin Eisendrath.
Hello, everybody. Happy Saturday. It's been another gruesome week. Wow. Look, you've heard we're in a constitutional crisis, but saying constitutional crisis speaks primarily to the small group of people that pay attention, close attention to questions of government structure. For the benefit of everybody, let's leave the legal terms for the courts and call this tyranny what it is. Look, what evidence do people need to see to admit, it's a terrible thing to admit, that we no longer live in a democracy, but rather under a despotic autocrat. I'm afraid that's where we are. It doesn't mean that's where we'll stay, but that's where we are. First, let's just go through the evidence. The rule of law no longer applies equally to all of us. Doesn't. Donald Trump went to the Justice Department and declared himself the nation's chief law enforcement officer. It's in that role that he pardoned the January 6th insurrectionists, people convicted of beating police officers, people convicted of engaging in seditious conspiracy. On the other hand, this week, Trump said, I look forward to watching the sick terrorist thugs get 20-year jail sentences for what they are doing to Elon Musk and Tesla. Perhaps they could serve them in the prisons of El Salvador, which have become so recently famous for such lovely conditions. Besides being sick, a nation that has two sets of laws, one for the leader's supporters and another for its detractors, is not a nation of laws, but a nation that uses the power of law as a weapon. Okay, I can hear you saying, but what about the judges? They're ruling against Trump. They're holding. Isn't that evidence that the rule of law is still here? And it's an important question. But consider this. The vice president said, when the courts stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did and say, the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. And Elon Musk has said, I don't like the precedent it sets when you defy a judicial ruling, but I'm just wondering what other options are these judges leaving us? And Stephen Miller, the advisor Trump singled out for praise when he was at the Justice Department, told Fox TV, our objective, one way or the other, is to make it clear that these district courts of this country do not have the authority to direct the functions of the executive branch, period. The rule of law either holds for all three branches of government or it holds for none. If the executive can do whatever he wants without the rule of law constraining him in any way, we do not live under the rule of law. Trump called for the judges who don't rule in his favor to be impeached. He and the real chief law enforcer of the land, Attorney General Pam Bondi, have launched ad hominem attacks on judges that hold the line, threatening them with impeachment, with prosecution, and implicitly with physical harm. I mean, remember, Trump created a cadre of armed vigilantes when he pardoned the January 6th plotters. Even John Roberts is alarmed. Yeah, so much for the rule of law in America. Well, second, the president is abusing his powers to weaken institutions that do not derive their credibility from him. In an autocracy, all truth, all credibility flows from the tyrant in charge. And that's why Trump took over the Kennedy Center. Like all tyrants, he wants to say what art is. That's why he attacked and broke Columbia University. He wants to say what education is. That's why he had his armed guards break into the Institute for Peace and throw out its leadership. He wants to determine where nonprofit funding goes. That's why he attacked and broke the law firm of Paul Weiss. It's why He continues his illegal attacks on law firms. He wants to say what clients they can represent. This is the stuff of tyrants. I mean, it's why he went and when the Associated Press continued to call that body of water the Gulf of Mexico, he banned them from the White House because he wants to say what things are. It's why he set Mr. Musk and his billions to primary and terrify any Republican who dares question his nominee. He wants to dictate what Congress does. And he's getting away with a lot of it. Law firms have caved. Universities have caved. The Republicans in Congress have caved. They're not standing up for us. This is what happens in an autocracy. Third, Trump claims unique powers and says he derives them not from the rule of law, but from a mandate of the American people. Again, that's what tyrants do. They pretend they have some mystical connection, usually to the race of a people, and then argue that that gives them powers that transcend law. In a democracy, the people's representatives get together and hammer out the law, sometimes over very big differences. And when they do, those laws determine what's allowed. But Trump is claiming the autocrat's mandate as he ignores the law. But look, he's wrong on that. He's also wrong on the mandate. He won an election, but without a majority. And once in office, he broke the pledges that helped put him there. I mean, which way does the mandate run when you get elected, distancing yourself from Project 2025, but then aggressively implement it when in office? Americans didn't switch sides in the Ukraine war and suddenly decide to support Mr. Putin. Trump did that by himself. Americans didn't suddenly decide that Social Security was a Ponzi scheme. Trump did that through his friend, Mr. Musk. Americans didn't decide to foreclose on our future by shutting down scientific research across our university systems. Mr. Trump did that. And Americans didn't decide to fire the staff of the IRS so that workers will have to wait to get refunds and billionaires won't have to pay taxes at all. This morning, a study came out and said Americans are going to lose $5 billion, maybe. I thought it was $5 billion. Maybe it was $50 billion. Maybe it was $500 billion from the rich people not paying taxes. Mr. Trump did that. Look, Americans didn't decide systematically to erase all mention of the remarkable accomplishments of Black and female soldiers from websites of our armed forces. Mr. Trump did. And Americans didn't decide that judges who oppose his lawlessness should themselves be prosecuted. Only Mr. Trump did. Oh, I could go on, but there you have it. His claims of legitimacy from a mandate don't exist. There is no mandate for what he's doing. I mean, he tells us the people are united in his cause. If we are united at all, it's in opposition to his cause. It took less than 60 days, and America ceased to be a fully democratic nation. That's the reality. But it doesn't mean that we're helpless. We still have the power to throw him out and to throw his fellow conspirators out of office. Yes, he's coming after us. Okay, so we got to man up to rebuild the foundations of the institutions he's damaged and to recommit to a heritage that is very important. This is it. We are in this fight. And as Abe Lincoln said, it is the fight to see whether we can save the last best hope of Earth. I'm in that fight. I know you are too. We're going to take a quick break, and someone else in that fight, Representative Sean Casten, is joining me when we come back.
You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Sean Casten represents Illinois' 6th Congressional District. He's a scientist. trained in molecular biology and biochemical engineering. He's exactly what Americans used to expect their congressional representatives to be. He listens to his constituents, he delivers for them, and all the while working in Congress on legislation that will move America forward. Sean, welcome.
Thanks. Nice to be here, Edwin.
Look, sometimes, we Americans decide to send some of our best off to fight in dangerous places. It's an enormously difficult decision, but one we make because we think we must. Today, one of those dangerous places is where we sent you. It's Congress. So let me start by thanking you for working every day and working, in a manner that exemplifies that body's role as sort of first among the branches that enable American democracy. That's not easy today.
Well, you're very kind, but I pinch myself every day that I get to do this job, and I'm always reminded of what Steny Hoyer told us when I was coming in 19, and he took all of us incoming freshmen, and he stood outside the Capitol Dome, and he said, if you ever don't get the chills when you walk into that building, thinking about everybody who served here before and that you get to have this job, then it's time to hang it up. And I still get those chills every day.
Yeah. When I go to Washington and I see the Capitol, I feel that way too, but I also now see January 6th when I look at it. So it's a complicated time for sure.
Well, I joke sometimes, and maybe it's not a funny joke, that the great thing our founders gave us was a representative democracy, and the terrible thing our founders gave us was a representative democracy, because we have a mix of wonderful people and talented people and smart people, and we also have people like Matt Gaetz who traffic children, and we have them in rough proportion to the proportion they exist in society, I suppose.
Oh, I hope that's not true. I hope you have them in a higher proportion due to things like gerrymandering. And I think you do. I think America is a far more decent place than the majority in Congress.
Well, that was our founders' bet, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I've found myself telling people at town halls this week that, go back and read what our founders wrote before they wrote the Constitution, because I think it's useful to think about, how they understood what a crazy idea it was to have a nation based on laws, because their experience was a nation based on kings who could decide which laws to implement, who to favor. And, I keep reading this old James Madison quote that he said that the goal is not to make sure that you elect virtuous people, but to make sure that you trust that the American people are collectively virtuous.
Yep.
He says we can't depend on the virtue of our leaders. We can't put confidence in that, but we have to put trust in the people who choose them.
Yeah.
That's the bet. That's the bet of a representative democracy based on rule of law, right?
It sure is.
And I think we all need to remind ourselves not only that the people we like who voted for the people we like are virtuous, but trust that the broader electorate also shares that virtue.
Yeah, and we have to encourage it in all of us. Let's talk about the cap and trade bill you just put in.
So this is a bill that I've probably been working on in some form for 20 years, long before I ever came to Congress. I had been involved in some clean energy groups in New England when the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, or RGGI, was being developed, and we were pushing for this kind of idea. And it is a bill to regulate the price of carbon, but CO2 emissions, that is. But we wanted to be informed first by the good policies that we have historically passed in this country that actually created cap-and-trade structures. And I would point out they were passed by the Reagan White House. The Montreal Protocol that closed the ozone hole was a cap-and-trade structure. The George H.W. Bush White House then extended that model to the acid rain trading program. The reason we still have maple sugar in New England is because of that program, because it massively cut down on acid rain pollution. And I can't stress, these were two Republican White Houses, and this was a Republican idea, but we wanted to take that idea and use it to fix what I think some of the Kyoto Protocol and most cap and trade programs in the country have gotten wrong. And specifically, the newer versions of cap and trade have gotten stuck in this political problem of how to set the cap. The idea behind the cap and trade is you say there's a certain amount of CO2 that's being emitted every year. We're going to cap it at that level, and we're going to ratchet down over time, as we should. That's the right way to do it. But once you go to saying, okay, for everybody who has a permit to pollute, how much of that cap do we apply to you? You're in a horrible political problem, because every polluter will tell you that they can't possibly reduce beyond their current levels. They need a bigger cap to account for unplanned surprises. And so whether in the New England program or in the international program in Kyoto, we have ended up massively over-allocating the right to pollute, which has kept the actual prices you get paid for reducing pollution way too low, because the market was flooded with free pollution rights. So what we've done in our bill, modeled on what happened in some of these earlier iterations, is to tie your right to pollute not to what you've historically done, but to the amount of useful energy you produce in a given year. The term of art in environmental policy is an output-based emission standard. So instead of being told you can pollute this many tons per year, we say a power plant could pollute this many tons per megawatt hour of useful electricity that they produce. Or, an industrial facility can pollute this many tons per million BTU of useful thermal energy they produce. And so what that does is says if you are providing something that people need, electricity, light, heat, then you'll get a pollution right pro rata with how much useful stuff you generate. And what you did historically, is what it is. But we'll set the level at the average historic level. So, as of right now, the United States power sector produces about 800 pounds, a little over 800 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour. Average coal plant produces about 2,000 pounds. The best gas plants produce a little over 700. And so if you put this in place right now, the best gas plants would have 100 pounds to sell for every megawatt hour they generate. The typical coal plants would have to buy 1,200. And, of course, if you have a solar panel, you'd have 800 to sell. And so by ratcheting down that level, number one, you don't get caught up in the politics of historic pollution levels. But number two, you don't change the price of energy, because the net amount paid by people who produce too much and the net amount received by people who produce below that level is all tied to the megawatt hours. So we're still producing the same number of megawatt hours. We're just transferring wealth behind the meter, if you will, from the dirty guys to the clean guys. This is, I guess, the third term I've introduced this. We've steadily tweaked with getting input from outside folks. And, in this Congress, where the Republican Party is committed to raising the price of energy and running away from clean things, I'm not hugely optimistic. But if we can get a Republican Party back that likes what Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush did, maybe there's a way to bring this forward.
And just before we get into the politics of it, over time, those levels change, right? The credits change because you're hoping to help phase out carbon problems, aren't you?
So, yes, that's exactly right. So what we've done is to say, and it gets complicated because the electric sector is not the only sector that's covered in this. But if we just look at this just from an electric sector, if the allowance was 800 pounds per megawatt hour this year, we then ratchet that down linearly to 0 in 20 years. And there's some adjustments to the formula in case you have leakage to other sectors. Maybe we start, shifting electricity generation or shifting fuel combustion overseas by exporting natural gas, and we're actually making things worse. So there's some corrections to take advantage of that. But basically, the structure says we're going to take that 800 number, take it to 0 in 20 years.
Yeah, a straight line.
So that if you're, essentially a straight line with some corrections for, unforeseen circumstances.
Yep.
and then part of what we did is there's this truth that I think we always need to remind people that clean energy and cheap energy are synonymous. The reason why the fossil sector doesn't like renewable energy is not because it's clean, it's because it's cheap and they can't compete against cheap. And anybody who has a solar panel on their roof knows this, because no one with a solar panel on their roof goes to bed at night and says, I better look at what power prices are tomorrow and see if it makes sense for me to run my solar array. Mm-hmm. Everybody who owns a coal plant has somebody whose job is to look at what the power price is the next day and see if they can make money given the current price of coal running that power plant. Yeah. So because of that, what we really want to do in clean energy policy is deploy clean energy. Once it's deployed, we don't have to really worry very much about whether it's going to operate because it has zero marginal operating cost. So what we've done to try to bring
Go ahead.
To try to bring that forward in this is to say that even though the allocation will slope down over the next 20 years, if two power plants enter into a long-term contract of at least 10 years, they can lock in this year's level. So the idea is that a coal plant who, in my example, would have to buy 1,200 pounds this year to comply, will say, you sign a 10-year contract with a solar array, you can lock in that you only have to buy 1,200 for the next 10 years. Meanwhile, the solar plant, who maybe they have 800 pounds of this year, and then they have 750 the next year, and then 700, they can lock in 800 pounds of revenue. So give both of those players an incentive to create revenue and cost certainty so that we can accelerate the deployment of clean energy and accelerate a grid that has more and more sources that are cheaper than coal. And it's an interesting dynamic, because what that ends up doing is turns the coal plant into a credit risk. Because if you're the solar plant and the coal facility says, I'm willing to sell you 1,200 pounds per megawatt hour 5 years from now, the solar array is going to say, well, how do I know you're going to generate a megawatt hour 5 years from now? Because you may not be economic anymore, right? But that's a good thing. But the idea is let's accelerate, and that's part of why I said that there's some scenarios where it's not a straight line decline, because I think if markets do what markets will do, the decline will be much faster.
Yeah, that's great. So one of the reasons I wanted to take the time at the beginning to talk about this is that legislation and legislating in the world we live in is complicated, and it requires expertise. It's not the same thing as the sort of knee-jerk policymaking we hear. We don't like, you pick it, whatever the target of the day is. So we're going to pass a law saying, right? You can't just pass a law saying, we're not going to have carbon pollution anymore. That's not how the world works. You have to do something that's thoughtful and difficult. So now let's get to the politics around this. And I want to ask this next question carefully and respectfully, because I love the work that you're doing. But it's a difficult question, because for passage, the bill requires a Congress that puts our future ahead of the fossil fuel companies' profits. We don't have that. To become law, it requires the signature of a president who's sane. We don't have that. To be implemented, it requires an EPA staffed with technically skilled experts who are empowered to regulate. Those experts are being fired, and the Supreme Court made it a lot harder for them to regulate in their last term. And I guess I want to ask you this. Before we get to how you're going to get it passed in the future, do you feel like sometimes you are, I don't know how to say this, like toiling away at a machine that no longer works, like the Morlocks in H.G. Wells's The Time Machine?
Well, sometimes. Yeah. I also think that, some of this goes back to what we said at the start about what our founders said about virtue, that you need to count on the fact that there are people who are in this job for the right reasons, and you can't guarantee it. And so you have to work with, you can complain about the cards you got dealt, but you got to play the cards that you got dealt. At the same time, and I don't want to be Pollyannish about this, we are this is a 5-alarm fire. We are in a constitutional crisis right now, and everything that you expressed is a really, really big problem. And I go to sleep at night and I wake up in the morning fearful of whether our democracy is going to survive. I'm not trying to sugarcoat that at all.
I know you're not.
However, it is not a particularly new thing that the right policy choice is not politically possible in this instant, or that there are members of Congress continuing to work at and refine the right policy choice so that when that political aperture opens, we can run through. What we did in the Inflation Reduction Act, many of those were bills that people had been working on for a long time, and all of a sudden the aperture was open and we could run through, but we could only run through with places where we'd already politically done the work. If you want to go back over an even longer time horizon on a totally different issue, in 2022, in response to the George Floyd murder and all the uprising of support for Black Lives Matter and trying to address some of those excesses, we passed the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, which made lynching a federal crime in America. If you just think about the word lynching, it seems almost anachronistic that we have that word. And so I started going back to say, what is the legacy of this bill? And Bobby Rush from Illinois had been carrying that bill through the entirety of his congressional career, trying to bring it forward, and the political aperture was never open. Bobby Rush didn't write that bill in the first instance. He picked it up from a member who had retired, and when he came in, that member retired, he picked up that bill. The first time that the House of Representatives passed a bill to make lynching a federal crime was in 1922. That 2022 bill that was called the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act was first written before Emmett Till was born. It took the Senate 100 years to break cloture, which is to say it took the Senate 100 years between when that bill passed the House and when we finally passed it into law for the Senate to decide we should even have a vote in the Senate on whether lynching is bad. Now, we can get really depressed about our history there. We can alternatively, take some pride in the fact that in 2022 the Senate finally decided to do the right thing. But the fact that it takes a long time for good policy to be good politics has never caused at least some members of Congress to not be focused on doing good policy so that we have the tool when it opens. And then, we depend on civil society and whatever, rhetorical gifts we have in our outside voices to try to expand the Overton window to make good policy politically possible.
Yeah.
And sometimes it takes way too long, but you got to do the work.
Well, and that's expanded to a different realm now, to a second realm. It's absolutely true and always has been, as you pointed out, that you have to do the policy work well in advance of getting the policy into law. And that's always been true. It's the things that we do, the great things that we do, we always do long after they're obvious. And they only became obvious because of the hard work that people put in for the years before. But now I think it's also true that this very important work that you're doing isn't just a prelude to finally passing it, a climate bill, if you will, a cap and trade bill, but it also demonstrates what we're trying to save when we talk about our democracy, about how this process works.
I can't say it better. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. I mean, the other part of this is, democracies aren't the only form of government where policy matters. The Chinese have taken up climate policy in their own way, too. And they create their own Overton windows in a different mechanism than we do, for sure. So I think the ability to do the policy is slightly different than the ability to get out there and talk to the public about the policy and to try and build the kind of support for it that lasts over the whims of a particular leader. And that is, I think, the biggest issue we are facing today.
Well, I mean, I think this is, and I have to be careful because I have never in my life taken a poli-sci class. But, I read a lot, and I think
you live
Plato
it.
who said that I think it was Plato who said that the best form of government is a benevolent despot. It's just hard to guarantee the benevolence. Fast forward, it's just another version of Churchill's old aphorism that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the other ones that have been tried.
Yep.
That democracy is messy. Can the Chinese, do they have the ability to, simply pass a mandate and force everybody to do it in an autocratic government? They do, although even in those forms of government, that power only survives up until you have mass uprisings in the street or military coups or things that become very disruptive. And, democracy is messier, but as long as we defend it, is stabler. Because as long as people trust that, okay, I may not like what happened this term, but we can fix that in the next election, rather than waiting until the son of 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 the king to get deposed in a military coup, right?
And I also I believe it's only legitimate form of government, because I actually do believe that the government's legitimacy rests on consent of the governed.
Yeah. And notwithstanding the way the far right has hijacked the term, I think we need to remind people all the time that when Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death," he wasn't calling for an anarchy. He was calling for the creation of a representative government where liberty was defined as something we achieve by making sure that through our representation, we have collective liberty. Not, I want individual liberty to go, dump my sewage on your yard or, shoot you because I don't like the color of your skin without consequence. And I think we need to take back as Democrats that understanding that our founders had of how a representative democratic government facilitates collective liberty, not the way that the term has been bastardized to say that it's just a free-for-all of individual liberty where whoever's strongest gets to take all the toys.
Yeah, I mean, the moment we're in that's taken, sort of my whole lifetime to get to is the reaction, I guess, to Brown versus Board of Education, but also to Congress waking up to ideas that the environment needs to be protected from polluters and consumers need to be protected from defective products. And this notion on the right is developed of freedom. It's exactly what you're talking about, that says, hey, I make something. I have a factory and I have land behind my factory and I can dump whatever poison I want because it's my land. And if it leaches out into somebody else's land, that's their problem. And I can build a defective car. It doesn't matter. The market will correct it. If it doesn't work, people won't buy it. If people die, people won't buy it. And that's their view of freedom. And it's not your view or my view.
Yeah. And I think to some degree, our government has always had that tension. I've always felt that, back in my corporate life, I felt that my job as a CEO in board meetings was to represent everybody, including who wasn't in the room, because typically a corporate board is staffed primarily by shareholders. Yep. It's rare that a corporate board has voices of your employees and certainly not of your customers in the boardroom. And yet, if every decision is to shift wealth towards your shareholders, that's you can raise your prices, you can fire your staff, but you're hurting your customers and your employees if you do that. I think in the same way, democracy, for it to work, you have to look out for people who aren't in the room. And anybody who has something to lose from a new piece of regulation has a lobbyist to make sure they don't lose it. Anybody who has something to gain from a piece of legislation that hasn't yet been crafted doesn't even know that it exists. Right. And so, to really have a thriving democracy and a thriving economy where there's there's small businesses and entrepreneurs who are saying, I've got a great way to save money. I've got a great way to compete against that, big company you just described that makes the bad car. They don't know what the tools are because they haven't had the idea yet. And I think we have to make sure that we look out for those folks. And what's scary about this moment is that if you're only looking out for the people who already have things to make them more powerful, well, one of the things you do is you look at Elon Musk as the world's richest man and say that guy needs a tax cut. There's only a short distance from that worldview to an ideology that says Russia took land from Ukraine and they are bigger and more powerful, so we should let them keep it.
Or we are bigger and more powerful, so we should turn Canada into a state.
Exactly. It's this
imperial mindset.
And it's the problem with this very naive, childish definition of liberty that in an anarchy everybody is not free. In an anarchy, the strongest get everything.
Yep.
And it's why most people on their 14th birthday stop thinking that Ayn Rand is smart. but
you live with a different group of people than I do. Most people haven't read Ayn Rand to begin with, and I'm glad at that, at least.
Yes, but I do work with some people who, still have a worldview informed by a book they read when they were 13-year-old boys, and it's usually as boys who have that. And it's it's science fiction. It's not the way that human nature actually works.
No. I don't want to live in a world where the answers to most questions are political. But today, courtesy of, MAGA and this president determined to replace, our rule of law with one man rule, I guess we're in that world. Where, you wrote to your constituents a letter called, I think it was called My Plan for the Trump administration. So talk a little bit about that and not just what it says, but why it was important to write down. So
part of this is because we are just getting swamped with phone calls with, I think virtually every phone call to our office is somewhere on a continuum between anger and fear. And I represent a very purple district. I think Kamala only won my district by 3 points. So you would expect in a district like this, we'd be getting, some significant number of phone calls saying, I really appreciate what Trump is doing. It's not happening. And I think what the Trump administration is trying to do is to encourage people who are on that continuum between fear and anger, that they stay closer to fear, because fear is paralyzing, particularly as we approach, martial law, and you've seen some of the threats, the way they're pushing these things. If they can convince you that if you stand up individually, they will see you and they will take you down, then they can paralyze you into inaction. Mm-hmm. The only way that we get past that is to inspire people to stand up collectively. And so a part of this was to say, let's point out the things that we have done, even from the minority where our tools are limited, but we've done things like, forcing the release of Matt Gaetz's ethics report to prevent him from becoming the Attorney General.
Thank God.
I don't know. As we learn more and more about Pam Bondi, I'm getting fewer and fewer thanks for that. But but to share that, not to brag about it, but to point out to people that even in these moments, you can do things that invite incoming fire and live to fight another day, because that courage becomes contagious. To share, the work we've been doing with outside groups to pursue litigation strategies. Jamie Raskin is heading up this group, but it was this handful of it who were part of a Project 2025 working group before the election, who have now become our House Democrats Rapid Response Task Force. And among the things we're doing is working with outside groups to prepare litigation against what the Trump administration is doing. Mm-hmm. I may have these numbers slightly off, but I think the numbers that Jamie shared with me yesterday was that we have worked with groups that have filed 126 cases, and 46 of those, the judges have issued temporary restraining orders blocking what the Trump administration was doing. Of the balance, some of them have not yet ruled. In some cases, the courts ruled that this particular issue was not yet ripe, but come along when, X, Y, or Z happens. In some cases, the courts have ruled that the party filing did not have standing in the court. But in no cases have the courts ruled unilaterally in the Trump administration's favor. And so, let's get people understanding that. Let's make sure that people know that we can be a resource. So if you, in fact, find yourself in a position where the government of the United States is not honoring the laws of the United States in a contractual relationship with you, reach out to our office. We'll do our best to connect you with folks where you might, be able to engage as a party in this litigation, make sure that you get protection. And I guess that brings sort of to the last thing, which everybody always asks, well, what can I do, right? Because we are in a constitutional crisis, not just the Democrats, not just the Republicans, and certainly not just the 270 elected Democrats in Washington. All of us as Americans are in a constitutional crisis. And we will get out of this quickly if we collectively rise up to stop it. And, so what are all the things that people could do to, in John Lewis's famous phrase, go make some good trouble.
Good trouble, yeah. We talk about that a lot on this show. Before we get to some good trouble, I want to ask you about one of those entities that needs protection that I fear you have not been able to help, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but I know it's important to you. I worry that, for a long time, the future was invented in the United States. And that's led to our dominance in all kinds of industries and in medicine, in science, in business. This attack on higher education is closing labs, is unemploying an entire generation of postdocs and grad students, particularly in sciences. We will lose, it's like the Cultural Revolution in China. We'll lose a generation of leadership and of progress at a time when science is accelerating so fast that we may never, ever catch up again. And what can we do to salvage research and what's going on in this attack on higher ed?
So I first want to make it very clear what the Trump administration is doing is illegal and unconstitutional. And if we assume that the Constitution doesn't matter and that the laws don't bind us, there's virtually nothing we can do because we're up against a tyrant, an unchecked tyrant. I'm not suggesting we give up, but I think we need to understand that we can't lose sight of the fact that Congress passes the laws and the executive branch executes those laws. Period. Full stop. That is the story.
I wish your colleagues believed you.
Well, not just my colleagues. I would ask any lawyers listening who are members of bar committees, why has every lawyer in the Trump White House who has signed off on an order that violates the law or the Constitution not yet been disbarred?
Yeah, I don't understand that either.
Right?
I don't understand it either.
And that's part of what I mean by people need to collectively stand up and not fear that they're going to get recourse, because some lawyer wrote the executive order that said we're going to no longer we're going to get rid of birthright citizenship, which is the plain text of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. Why does that lawyer still have a job? Why is that lawyer still allowed in any court in the country, right? And we collectively, all of us, have tools to affect that. To get them to to try to be, a little bit more, prescriptive, because I'm obviously jumping my tone. I'm not giving up. The attacks on education and intelligence broadly are unfortunately deep in the rot of the elected Republican Party. There has been a hostility to public education for a long time. I'd go back to, James Baldwin's line back in the 50s when he said the purpose of education is to force people to think for themselves, to ask what is black, what is white, what is up, what is down, is there a God in the heavens or not? The only way society progresses is if we have those pieces around, and no society really wants that type of person around. That's as best as I can do a direct quote from James Baldwin.
Yeah.
So the commitment that the United States made, first, back at the turn of the last century, and then, certainly ramping up after post-World War II, to make sure that every American had access to a good K-12 education and then a premier research institution is a fundamentally progressive idea. It is fundamentally a bet on making the future different than where we were before, and is deeply opposed by a lowercase c conservative ideology that says I don't want things to change, right? And that's scary and threatening, and I think we can get that, and we can empathize with it. I mean, we all know someone in our life who has a job that technology made obsolete, and as much as we can tell ourselves some story that in aggregate technology creates more jobs than it destroys, which it always has, it almost never creates jobs for the people it displaces, right? And so I think it's important to be sensitive and empathize with that. But if we in the United States are not the country that's pushing science forward anymore, who steps into that void? And I can virtually guarantee we're not going to be happy with that answer.
No. Because change doesn't stop. The question is who can at least put their hand on the future and guide it a little bit.
Exactly, and frankly, it's not just a question of like where is scientific research going to happen, but think about like the human side of this. If you are the next generation's Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, one of these, Benjamin Franklin, and you have a great idea, and you're getting out of college and you want to deploy your idea. For a long time, the United States was where you wanted to be. If you're getting out of college today and you look at the Trump administration, and you've got, one offer to go to work in the United States, which has apparently, decided to put vaccine deniers in charge of HHS and, and complete idiots in charge of our scientific agencies. And you've instead got an offer to go to work in Canada or China.
Yep.
Where do you go, right? I mean, how much of what we created after World War II was because we attracted all of these German scientists to come to the United States because they didn't feel like they could do what they ethically wanted to do in Germany.
Right. Our whole space program, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. In Illinois, you go to Fermilab and ask yourself, why is this place named after a guy with an Italian-sounding name?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I can't understand.
Who would split an atom under a football stadium today? I don't know.
Yeah,
seems dangerous.
Yeah,
but
exactly. But if the Trump administration was entirely staffed with plants from the Russian and Chinese governments who wanted to take over the U.S. government and destroy it from within to benefit their economies, what would they be doing differently from what they're doing right now?
Yeah. All right. We have only a few minutes left, so I want to reserve just some time for this, which I always ask. Tell people a little bit about your constituents and your district. You touched on it being purple. What do you love about it? Why is it special? That's just, we don't celebrate ourselves like we should.
So I love the question. So I spent the first 2 terms of my congressional career representing a district that had been gerrymandered to be the Republican vote sink in 2010.
Yep.
And so, I was Barrington, St. Charles, Naperville, Hinsdale, Downers Grove, where I live. And, fairly white, fairly highly educated, fairly affluent, the kind of people who once upon a time were the bedrock of the Republican Party. And, and their education sort of drove them away. And I still have, when the maps got redrawn, I still have sort of a chunk of that community. But also now picked up big chunks of the South Side, Oak Lawn, Allsip, down to Orland Park, Mount Greenwood, some neighborhoods in Chicago, Beverly. Mm-hmm. And I now, with the new district, I have the highest percentage of union households of any district in Illinois. Whole lot of folks in the building trades, a lot of police, a lot of firefighters, a lot of teachers. And there's something that I just love about this new district, that I have one part where people live and another part where people work. I remember driving around Allsip with Mayor Ryan down there, and we're seeing just all this truck traffic that's coming in and out of the Belt Rail Yard, and all the industrial stuff around there just south of 55. And Mayor Ryan said, I love seeing all these trucks because it's a sign that it's a sign of economic opportunity in the community. And I sort of laughed and I said, I've never heard that from the mayor of Wheaton.
Right. It's like the trucks are a problem up there. Yeah.
Going through downtown Wheaton would be a political problem in Wheaton, but it's a political opportunity down here. And it's a nice reminder that, we need we need all of that diversity in our community. Yeah. And it's I think it makes me better at my job to make sure that I can go from one meeting with the mayor of Wheaton to another meeting at the mayor of Allsip, and understand that we've, within this region, we all got to find a way to uplift ourselves and do something that lifts us all together.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's awesome.
That's democracy in a nutshell, right?
Yep. And man, that Belt Rail Yard is awesome. I'm in awe of the amount of goods that move through this part of the country.
Yeah. No, I mean, 30% of all rail cars in America spend at least 24 hours of every year in the Belt Rail Yard.
Yeah. Crazy. Amazing.
Yeah.
And people don't really know it. It just does its job.
Well, people know it as the thing that slows up traffic. But better to be in the place where lots of industrial activity is making it hard for you to get across town than to live in a ghost town that's easy to drive across, right?
Yep. Well, thank you for your time today and for the amazing work, not just the committee work that requires expertise, but the work to remind everybody what Thomas Paine meant in common sense, that we should still have some, and that it resides in our people, and that ultimately we'll do the right thing.
Well, and, if you're going to close with Thomas Paine, our great title is As Americans, our lesser one varies by the place. It is by our great title we are known as abroad, and by our lesser title we are known at home. Yeah. Just keep in mind, we are all Americans. We're not red states and blue states, not to sound like Obama, but we got to stay united, that we're all in this together. Paine got it in 1776, and it's still true.
Yep. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care, Edwin.
Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Okay. Welcome back, everybody. Ohio was once a state that led the nation forward. It was home to many of the country's biggest companies. It was a place that had some of the best schools in the nation. The quality of life and the opportunities for getting ahead drew people from all over to the state. Today, well, it's still got its charms, but decades of corruption and collusion between corporate and government leaders have stolen Ohio's future. And that's why we spend so much time talking about the state, because Ohio, it's like the ghost of Christmas yet to come. It's a warning for the whole country about what we could be facing. And happily, David DeWitt, editor-in-chief of the Ohio Capital Journal, has helped us understand it, and he is back with us again. Hi, David.
Hi, Edwin. Thank you so much for having me. Nice to talk to you again.
Nice to talk to you. And I hope you didn't find my musing about your state to be unfair.
No, actually, I was thinking about it, and just 80 years ago, Ohio had 6 of the 15 wealthiest cities in the United States, and well, that's simply no longer true. But yes, it just put me in mind of some of the things in the past and what's happened in the ensuing decades and how it relates to the moment we're in now.
And it does relate. I mean, your history is such an example of what could happen, what is happening to the nation in Washington. I thought it was entirely fitting that your governor, Mike DeWine, was in Washington for the murder of the Department of Education. After all, I think Ohio is home to one of the greatest public education frauds in all of history, isn't it?
Yeah, so we have, over the last 20 years, slowly expanded from, first what happened was our system of education was declared unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court because it was so heavily reliant on property taxes that the gap between rich districts and poor districts was just astronomical, and the biggest achievement gap in education is directly correlated to poverty. So we were seeing these insane, disparate outcomes in education. So unconstitutional. But we didn't fix it. Instead of fixing public schools, what lawmakers did was they participated in what I would say is a national campaign that's gone along those same lines to point the finger at public education, say that it's failing, and attempt to privatize it in every way possible. And so over the last 20 years in Ohio, we saw first charters were expanded from their traditional role into allowing private companies to run and operate charters. Then that became online charters. Then we saw voucher expansions for private schools. And then most recently, we've seen near universal private school voucher expansions. And this came after, just back in 2018, we had one of the biggest online charter school scandals ever. This company drew up its charter school plan on the back of literally a Waffle House napkin, and they bilked the state of billions of dollars running online virtual academies. This is called ECOT, is the name of it. And the state lost at least $600 million, maybe more, because they were falsifying attendance. Students weren't actually logging attendance, and they were taking state money for time that students weren't attending class. So taxpayers got bilked out of that $600 million right there. And then state lawmakers, again, instead of really fixing anything, they turn around and make universal private school vouchers, which is now costing the state about $1 billion a year. But the vast majority of those new vouchers are going to families that were already sending their kids to private schools. So they're just getting a windfall subsidy of their private education they were already doing on the back of the taxpayers. And meanwhile, public schools, we're going through another budget cycle. 2 budget cycles ago, they tried to implement a full fair funding plan. They are, if they follow through with that implementation in this budget cycle, public schools will continue that new model for a constitutional system in Ohio, but they're not adjusting for inflation. So it winds up being like a couple $100 million in cuts to the public schools, while even more about another $500 million goes toward the private schools and charters. So you're just seeing this. You hear it a lot, the privatization of education.
How's that? Okay, it's happening, but is it solving the problem? Are those disparate? Are education opportunities more equally distributed because it's in the private sector? Are kids in those impacted schools with particularly bad results 20 years ago doing better now that they have had all this time to try their theory out?
Well, that's a great question. And in short, the answer is no. So first of all, the expansion of private school charters mostly already helps people who were already going to private school, but also it, in a lot of ways, resegregates schools. You see unreflective demographics in most of our charter and private schools, the converse side of unreflective demographics in the public schools nearby. So there's that kind of reverse segregation, or that resegregation, I guess, element to it. But then also, as far as accountability and performance, while they've been, making standardized testing and requirements and just showering public schools with all sorts of things, the charter schools and the private schools have nothing. The charter schools have minimal oversight and accountability.
So we don't know if they're doing a good job. So we do know who they're not doing it for. And anyway, we don't know if they're doing it well. Wow,
Correct.
that's really a success after 20 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can be really proud of that.
What we do have are that they don't outperform their public school counterparts. By and large, charter schools.
Pathetic.
Not.
Yeah. So pathetic. Well, let's stay. I just want to stay with this for a bit, because I put myself through watching some of Governor DeWine's State of the State address recently, and a bunch of it was about education. And it sounded positively progressive, with budget requests and earned income tax credit, special effort to get kids glasses who need them.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just all cover for this wholesale privatization?
Well, so it's interesting because DeWine is genuine about some of that. I mean, he is trying to get kids vision and dental and things like that, and kind of bite around the edges. So we're in a very gerrymandered state here in Ohio, as we've discussed many times.
Yes.
There are gradations of the level of antipathy of Republicans toward private education. Some Republicans, especially the ones in rural areas who don't have a charter school or private school anywhere nearby and rely on public schools, they're in favor of public schools. I would say DeWine falls somewhere in the middle. As it was actually his lieutenant governor, now U.S. Senator John Husted, who played a much, much larger role in the privatization movement of education here in Ohio.
Rewarding him with a Senate seat.
Because, DeWine was a U.S. Senator, and then he was an attorney general, so he wasn't a lawmaker, So only as governor as he had this involvement. And DeWine's a very, scratch my back, I'll scratch yours type of guy. He's very transactional, very backroom political deal-making, pay-to-play type stuff. He thinks it's normal politics. He doesn't realize that that's all really shady and abnormal. But so I would say that he is not he actually does care about children, and he wants to do what he can for education, but he's also a political so what I think he was doing at the Trump thing, for instance, was he was trying probably to back channel to get Trump to send money directly to states and stuff, and like making sure that some of those funds were still there, as opposed to just cheering Trump on like for destroying the Department of Education. He was probably trying to work behind the scenes influence to like keep some of that special needs money and stuff. But when it comes to Ohio, he's kind of like well, you see his priorities in his budget. We don't need to speculate. He takes $200 million from the public schools, and he gives another $600 million to the private schools. So he cares about both to some degree, but he clearly prefers one, right? Like that's what his budget says. So
Yep. Well, let's move from K-12 to higher ed, because Columbus is the fastest growing city in Ohio. It's one of the fastest growing cities, I think, anywhere in the country. But that growth isn't coming because it's the state's capital, for gosh sakes. It's coming because of the economic generativity of Ohio State University. But now all of that's at risk, since it's squarely in the bullseye of the Trump administration, and all that research is getting shut down now. What I didn't hear DeWine on that. Did he condemn the attack on higher ed?
No, I mean, the moral cowardice these days, the silence that you hear from every sector is just, if you read enough history, it's not surprising, but I don't think it ever stops being disappointing. Because it's just, they all think that if they keep their heads down and say their yes sirs and no sirs and, try to play nice, that they won't end up under the wrecking ball. And I don't agree with them. I think that they're gonna be pulled under regardless, so they might as well speak up for themselves. But yeah, you're right. The Ohio State University and the University of Cincinnati are two of the ones listed by the Trump administration in their, strongman mafioso-esque shaking down of American institutions of higher education, basically just financially extorting these institutions into doing their bidding. I get that the administrators are in a tough position, but the administrators of Ohio State, Mike DeWine, they all seem to be completely unwilling right now to say anything publicly. So whatever efforts they're trying to do must be happening privately.
Right. Instead, publicly, they've said they're shutting labs and they're not hiring postdocs, and a generation of young scholars is going to go find something else to do rather than invent the future. That's what they said.
Yeah, it's devastating. It's devastating for these institutions themselves, and that's why I don't know why they're not screaming bloody murder about it, especially the leaders of the institutions. It's really been up to the students, and the professors are the only ones who are saying that this is wrong and talking about how devastating it will be. Everyone else seems to be trying to go along to get along, but I don't think it's going to save them from the wrecking ball. And yeah, like Ohio State is one of the biggest it's the biggest research institution in Ohio. The downstream effects of all of this it won't just affect Ohio State, it will affect Columbus and the state of Ohio. And, I don't know why people need to feel all of this pain to recognize what's happening, but it seems to me that at this point, America has bought for something, and we're gonna have to pay the piper for it now.
Say what you mean.
So I think
say more about that.
I think there's a lot of pain on the way. I think that as a society, as a nation, you can't ignore reality like this. You can't be this irresponsible. You can't allow this to happen to yourselves without paying for it. And so I think we're going to have to go through a period where we're going to have to pay the price for this. And we're going to see it manifest in a lot of ways, including, all just sorts of different programs and grants and research and layoffs and stuff at our universities. My optimistic hope is that on the other side of this, when people are shocked by how quickly so many things can be taken down, that perhaps we can make the opportunity to build something back that was even better than before. But it's going to take a really long time because we're going to have to go through a lot before we get to there.
I don't even know. Today, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal ran a piece that said people inside the IRS think we could lose $500 billion in 1 year of tax revenue. 10% of the tax revenue of the country could vanish because of the firing of IRS agents. Now, let's be clear. Not a single Ohioan who's paying taxes from payroll deductions is going to miss a tax payment. All of that $500 billion is going to come from the very wealthy whose taxes are paid in a different way. right? Not out of their payroll taxes. So while you and I wait to see if we can ever get a refund from taxes we've overpaid, these guys are going to underpay by 10% of the value of the American tax revenue in a country. I cannot believe that ordinary Ohioans are going to sit back and pay for the lifestyles of the rich and famous by going along with the rules while other guys cheat.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly I think what you're talking about and the way you're talking about it is exactly what most people need to know and recognize and realize, because I know that a lot of Americans don't spend a lot of time like looking around at the rest of the world, but if you do, like, this playbook is not new. It's actually pretty boring and old, but it's the same thing that, you know, like everyone talks about, like Orban and Hungary, but like, I mean, I was reading Alexei Navalny's book, and like a lot of this is even very much like Putin-esque, and it's certainly, you know, Turkey, Erdogan, all of them, like, and at base of it, what I think people really need to realize is that this is about simple, like, greed, power, and corruption at the end of the day. Like, they're destroying all this stuff, and all of that's like a horror show, and it's really hard to stomach, right? But what you're talking about, the fact that they're going to get filthy rich doing this, like, I know Elon's already filthy rich, but all of the rest of them are also going to get filthy rich doing this, because that's always the game throughout history, even across the globe in modern society. It's all corruption, really.
Creates these oligarchs. They don't play by the rules the rest of us play by. We follow the rules. They cheat. They rule. We are ruled. That's not a democracy. And, you know, it's like Putin. You said it too. So, I mean, Ohio's a state where, I mean, you got a big Air Force base, I think, near Dayton, Wright-Patterson, I think. You got, you know, an Air Reserve Station. You got a lot of people in that state who served in the armed forces. How could they, you know, how do they feel about switching sides in a war and abandoning Ukraine and supporting Putin? It's all of a piece, right? The side that has the oligarchs that cheat is the side our government's on, at home and abroad. That cannot be a message that Ohioans have the stomach for.
I can't imagine so, because if you look at an American polls, like, Americans don't like Putin. Like, he's got like 86% of Americans typically disapprove. Like, they don't like Putin. So, I don't know how all of that ends up playing out, but like, no, I don't see why Ohioans would go along with that. And I think that, like all the corruption that we've seen in Ohio, politicians getting rich on the people's dime, that's what we're seeing from the Trump regime. And that's what defines the Putin regime, is that, you know, this mid-level bureaucrat has a $5 million condo in Miami. You know, like, it's that type of petty corruption. And so I think that really always has to be emphasized.
Yeah. So I don't understand how, you know, elections are pretty close in Ohio. I mean, Republicans have an edge still. You gave us our vice president, who is, at least in the rest of the country, the least popular vice president we've ever had, just saying something. But, I mean, when I look at your paper, the Ohio Capital Journal, you know, the headline is Republicans celebrate the executive order to get rid of the Department of Education. And and based on the conversation we've had, I don't know how that squares with the voters.
You know, one thing that I always think about that's kind of interesting is when you pull this, like, almost everybody likes their neighborhood school and their kids' teachers. But when you start talking about them about education broadly, then that's when all of the propaganda gets its hooks into them. Because I guess I'm one of the few to continue to try to note, you know, scream into the void that, like, American education is not failing like everyone says. Throughout, like, every decade, our educational accomplishments have gotten better and better, like, by the metrics of graduation rates, by how many people are obtaining what degrees, like by the educational test indicators themselves. So there's this narrative that, like, public education is failing across the country. Now, there are huge disparities that are almost all directly tied to poverty. But overall, American education is not failing. So I think a lot of it has to do with propaganda, warping public perception, especially when it comes to the idea of education as opposed to the actual school that they go to and, like, see the art projects and have teacher-parent conferences and stuff. And I'm not sure who needs to do what to, like, get people to wake up about how education is absolutely critical to building a lasting, successful society. Because you need a society that is on its downfall destroys education. A society building itself up builds up education.
I mean, don't mince words here. I think you wrote, didn't you? I read an article of yours, I'm sure. It said a moronic, shameful low is how I think you described it.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's what I think that, like I wrote in that column this week. I mean, I think this will be remembered on similar terms as, prosecuting Galileo for the heliocentric view of the solar system, or making Socrates drink the hemlock for corrupting the youth, supposedly. Like, this is that type of mindless mass hysteria moment, or at least they're executing it on behalf of their followers, where... Yeah, you know what inspired me to write that? And it's just moronic. It's really, really dumb what we're doing right now. And what I was thinking about was just, like, all of the people of learning and education and who have, like, dedicated their lives to studying the humanities and trying to help humanity be better, not make a bunch of money by, selling a bunch of stuff to other people, or, like, we need all types in societies, right? So we need people doing the selling and stuff, but we need people who are dedicated to how to make life better for everybody. And they do a bunch of great research, and actually America is, like, that should be something that we should be so proud of, because we have done amazing things in this country scientifically and with our research institutions. We have accomplished extraordinary feats because it's the combination. You can have research institutions without liberal democracy. I mean, Oxford's been around as long as the British monarchy, but you can't have freedom of academia and freedom of inquiry the way that you can with a liberal democracy. And so that's why I think that we saw so much academia really flourish in America. And so to just see a bunch of angry, largely really hostile people toward education just ripping down education, I mean, it's like an angry mob going after.
Yes, and you see them ripping it down in texts on a cell phone that exists because of technology invented in these schools. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So the irony is just layered and terrible, but it's just, that it's like, all right, this moment won't last in history. This era will end and a new era will come. What will this era be looked at? It will be looked at really a moronic and stupid low for our country. Like, this is just, it's insane. There's no reason.
Let me go back to where I began. In the couple little minutes we have, like, I think Ohio is a view into America's, the fight that the whole country is going through. You've been going through for a while in Ohio. It didn't start, in Washington, January 20th. You've been fighting it for a long time. But even in Ohio, where the voters voted a constitutional amendment that said we can't gerrymander anymore, the Republicans in charge still gerrymandered and got away with it. And I worry that what we have seen in Ohio is a lesson that says we cannot compromise. We have to beat these people. We have to beat them by enough so they can't throw out the votes. And then we have to make illegal the kind of gerrymandering that has allowed this small, empowered minority to dictate to the country.
Oh, yeah. Gerrymandering is a fundamental poison because then elections don't matter. The representatives are interchangeable. There are no choices for voters. And if voters don't have choice, then the whole system's a mockery. It's a farce.
Yep. Well, that's the view from Ohio, and I really appreciate your time as always. It's so fun to catch up with you and this to get your view on, what's this democracy fight in a state that is so important and has been for such a long time, such an example that honestly the Republicans have used in their efforts around the country in different states. Let's hope it isn't the one that catches at the national level, but that's where we are now. David, Thank you.
We're gonna keep shining the light of truth and fighting for that. So thank you, Edwin. I always appreciate talking to you. It's great to be on. Thank you.
Take care. All right, everybody. That's the view from Ohio. We're going to get a view from the Netherlands when we come back.
You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Okay, everybody, welcome back. You may remember Lisa Kaufman. She's been on before. She joins us from the Netherlands, where she is an assistant professor of Russian discourse and politics at the University of Groningen. We first talked in the run-up to the Ukraine war, just about what she was hearing on, sort of Russian social media at the time. And then the last time we talked, it was about her, this fabulous book that she co-authored called The Trump Carnival, which was a way of thinking about the phenomena of MAGA. And I thought it was a good time to catch up again. Lisa, welcome back.
Thank you, Edwin. Nice to be back.
So I want to talk to you about America and Europe, about Ukraine and Russia. But before we get into that, can I go back to your book for a minute? Because I keep thinking about it.
Sure.
At its heart, you talk about sort of the cultural need from time to time for transgression, how people just need to, mock those in power and find a safe way to do that, because it's historically that's been part of making a society stable, I guess, a place to blow off that kind of energy. But every time this carnival that you've talked about, it's been a break from reality as opposed to reality, itself. It's like in Shakespeare when he sends confused young people into the forest. Things happen, but they come back and they have to deal with what happened when they were gone. I guess in the United States, we say that, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. But today that madness has real power. Its destructive side isn't constrained by the bounds of a festival movement. It's our lives. What does that mean?
Well, the thing is that when we were writing this book, we were really hoping that it would be kind of a historical that the book would have a kind of a historical relevance, because we finished it in January. It was published in January 24. So we were kind of hoping that people would read it, journalists would read it, and they would, make sense of our argument and not vote for Trump, technically. But then, of course, that did not pan out. We were... unfortunately, the shelf life of that book has increased dramatically. And I think that what my co-author Bharath and I were trying to showcase is that how transgression actually becomes attractive. Because historically, when you had carnival time, at least in Europe and especially Western Europe, this transgression was just a way to also maintain the existing status quo. Because when you are blowing off steam during the carnival, you still are you're making fun of the people in power, but then again, you still have marginalized communities that are still becoming the butt of the joke. And this was something that is also helped to maintain the status quo beyond the carnival. So once the carnival ended, the same elite was in power that allowed the people to blow off steam, make fun of the minorities and them, but then the minorities became targets of abuse outside of the carnival as well, and the elite still stayed in power. So that's why a lot of scholars actually talked about how Carnival actually stabilized the political system in a way. And yes, we can use a lot of carnivalesque methods to challenge the authorities, to make fun of them, because especially in authoritarian regime, carnivalesque humor and sort of making fun of those in power is essentially the only tool that the downtrodden people have. And that's why, for example, if you take a look at the historical, historically how people actually challenged those in power, they would make fun of them, because that's the part that those in power hate the most. They don't like to appear ridiculous or weird. And that's also why I think that Tim Walz's kind of battle cry when he, shortly before he became the running mate for Kamala Harris, when calling people weird, I think was a very effective tactic at that point in time. And I was really surprised to see it was sort of fading away from the campaign over time, because this was actually a very effective rhetorical strategy, also carnivalesque in a way. But the good thing about that specific carnivalesque strategy is that it was not denigrating people who were not in power, who were not marginalized. They were not making fun of the people who were not in power. Yep. That's why it was so important, because you're if you actually want to make fun of somebody, you're supposed to challenge those who are above you and not below you. And that's also what makes the Trump carnival so dangerous, because they are not really ridiculing or even denigrating the people who are above them. They're always going for those who don't have as many rights or privileges as they do.
Well, now it's entrenched and it's in power. And I have this sinking feeling, and I wonder if there's any research on this, that once this is established in power, the only path it has is sort of further radicalization, because the leaders either continue to find enemies to radicalize their base and get them angry, or their base will kill them. And so it's a race between Trump and this base that he's created to see who can be the most transgressive, the most destructive.
Yeah, so the problem here is also that one of the inherent qualities of this kind of violent carnival is its violence specifically. So it's bloodthirst. And we could also see that in the run-up to the election. If you remember this whole assassination attempt on Trump specifically, it was actually perpetrated by a right-wing person, because in a carnivalesque setting, when your mock king is not radical or is not enough for you, you have sort of the right to take power over him. So when I saw that person who shot at Trump was actually a right wing, I was like, okay, yeah, that totally makes sense in our carnivalesque framework, because in this understanding, they have the power and they have the violent tools at their disposal to also depose the king that they think is theirs to depose. So in that regard, yes, there is a real danger of the spiral of violence also within the movement, because this is one of the tools that they see as legitimate, not just against their opponents, but also against themselves. And this is something what also scares me, because there's, for example, when we read historically how some of the pogroms were perpetrated, they were also extremely carnivalesque and violent. So violence was actually part of the fun, essentially. And a lot of scholars from the U.S. also showcase how lynchings, for example, were also extremely carnivalesque in their nature. So the violence was part of the fun there. And again, it was targeted against the people who were targeted were obviously those who had zero power. It was during the Jim Crow era. And of course, they were the targets of that very brutal acts, or also so-called extra-lethal violence. So it's not just about violence that supposed to maim or hurt people, but also it's supposed to showcase somebody else's power over the person who's being violated. So that's why it's called extra-lethal. It's not just the lethality of the violence, but also it's showiness and this
message
really
of power.
Exactly. It's the message about the violence itself. It's also almost as important as the violent act in itself.
So we have here now um, um, people who were convicted of seditious conspiracy in January 6th, pardoned by President Trump. They form a militia that's out there that he can call upon. And we have him engaged in vicious ad hominem attacks on judges who are upholding the rule of law in America. And those judges are in fear of their lives and they're in fear of their families' safety. This is the kind of thing that your theory would have expected.
Yes, that's exactly what we expected in our theory. That's what makes me so anxious, because essentially, again, violence is one of the tools that they see as legitimate, because especially when this authority of the mock king is being challenged in Carnival, that's also that's a massive transgression from the crowd. So that's why you need to rectify that, and often with very violent means. And also what my other colleagues are looking into is also this whole idea of charisma and cult within the MAGA movement. And I think that's also something that also plays into this. It's a kind of a combination of different factors there because of this almost cult-like personality that is emerging there. It's like when you're not even supposed to question anything. And then again, it also was something that was spearheaded by the Supreme Court, I'm afraid, when they essentially rejected the case against Trump even before he was reelected. But also just the fact that you cannot do any wrong because you're president, even though that's obviously not the case if you read the Constitution. And I know that you do read the Constitution. So this is something that is extremely concerning, because once you get into an authoritarian state, it's very hard to get out of that authoritarian spiral. And a lot of my colleagues have already downgraded American democracy from the democratic status into the sliding authoritarianism. So this is very... By
the way, Lisa, I do not believe we live in a full democracy anymore, and it took 60 days to do it, and it took 10 years of Supreme Court decisions. But yes, we don't. We have to fight hard to get it back.
Yeah, absolutely. It's extremely concerning. And again, because there is essentially this, as you called it, militia that is kind of on a back and call of a lot of MAGA politicians who are essentially targeting those who disagree with them. And again, it could be comedians, it could be comedians, it could be lawyers, it could be judges, it could be even Republican appointed judges who are not
Republican lawmakers too, to keep them in line.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I also
we saw that
investigate.
Yeah, it happened. There were large threats to some of the senators when the Trump cabinet appointments were up to get them to stay in line.
Absolutely, and this is how you also enforce it. Essentially, the discipline in among the cult. So, because any deviation from the party line gets essentially violently punished.
So let me change the subject a little bit now that we've sort of established where we are. What's the feeling where you are when you see our president change sides in the middle of a war? And I don't know if you actually saw that moment with President Zelensky in the Oval Office.
Of course I did.
I was sick to my stomach. I don't know what was the feeling in it. I mean, you're not that far from where that misery is happening. What was the feeling?
Honestly, it was when I first saw that, it was kind of a feeling of a very intense feeling of a secondhand embarrassment. There's a word for that in German, of course. It's called Fremdschämen. But it was so jarring to see this kind of situation unfolding in the White House, in the Oval Office. But also it just was very clear. I mean, it was also clear even before the re-election that obviously J.D. Vance or Donald Trump do not care about Ukraine at all. And if anything, Donald Trump wants to get back at Zelensky for not facilitating his investigation into Hunter Biden. So it was very obvious even before the re-election that Ukraine is going to be in a very tough spot. But also, I mean, for me, maybe because I have this carnivalesque bias in my head, but it's also this whole meeting seems extremely showy to me. It seemed like a whole spectacle. And I think it was even remarked at some point, oh, it would make great TV. And I think it was, in fact, made for TV because this was it was full of these sound bites that were very helpful for Trump in this whole conversation.
The person who said it would make great TV was Donald Trump.
Well, yeah, and it absolutely did. I mean, those clips were all over social media, on TV, everywhere. And what's really concerned me, though, is that kind of my reading of those clips, or your reading of those clips, is not the same as some people do have. And some people were actually completely agreeing with the fact, oh, Zelensky should have worn a suit. So this kind of absolutely ridiculous comments about this meeting, about like, oh, this is inappropriate to wear a suit, or it's inappropriate to contradict the American president. So they were actually also quite common among a lot of other people. So this is not, unfortunately, there is not a single view of that meeting. But I think that among most politicians in Europe, what this meeting did provoke is this idea of that, okay, the U.S. is just not a reliable partner anymore. And something needs to be done in order to make sure that Ukraine is not left alone facing Russian invasion. So I think that this was a massive wake-up call for a lot of European leaders. And I'm a little bit surprised that it took them so long to wake up to that, frankly, because I think it was very obvious way before, maybe in, 2019 already, that it was that Trump will never be a strong supporter of Ukraine in the first place. You could also see that during the re-election campaign,
Europe,
or even now.
No.
Yep. So
let's talk a little about Russia. You've spent a lot of time studying it, and when social media feeds were available, you were able to study them and see what's going on there. What has these years of war done to Russia?
Well, for starters, it has restricted the media sphere so much that it's pretty impossible to study what exactly is happening in social media, because there is just so many laws restricting any critique that it's. At some point, I even calculated how many years I would get in prison for talking to my students about the war. And it ranged between 6 and 20, essentially. So depending on how you qualify what I say. So you can get essentially in prison for saying that Crimea is Ukrainian. That would be calling for disintegration of the Russian territory. That's about 6 to 8 years. You can be judged for treason by cooperating with an international institution. Again, about up to 20 years in prison. You can be sent to prison for things like discrediting the Russian army. And again, sometimes things like just describing the frontline situation could be seen as discrediting the Russian army, or even discussing the actual military losses in Russia is also something that is punishable by law. So it's almost impossible to talk about the war or critique it in any meaningful way in the Russian media sphere. And of course, a lot of people who did dare to do that either are in exile or they have received massive sentences. So a most recent case, I think, was about 16 years. A senior person received 16 years sentence for talking about the explosion on the Crimean Bridge, for example. So you just have this really horrendous criminal sentences for people who dare to criticize the regime, and this is something that is. It has its effect. It's not just the effect on the people who are thrown into prison, but also on the families and also on random people who see those horrific sentences, and they are now afraid to speak themselves because they know what might happen to them if they do. And again, this is unfortunately a very effective tactic. This is something that has been done also during the Soviet era, when you knew somebody who went to prison, and you were the whole idea of dissidence was very scary to a lot of people, because you knew what might happen to you, or you knew somebody who it happened to, and it would really scare you into not doing this.
So, Lisa, I remember at the beginning of the war, there were people in Russia who were told they couldn't protest, they couldn't say anything against it, so they would go behind a camera with a blank sheet of paper, thinking that I'm not saying anything against it. I'm just standing there with a blank sheet of paper. They got disappeared, right?
Well, a lot of things that at the beginning of the war, there was still not the legislation in place to all of that legislation that followed in early March. So that's why at the beginning you could still sort of go on the streets. You were arrested, but essentially there was not the legislation in place to put you into prison. But right now this legislation is in place, so even standing outside with a clean sheet of paper would get you into trouble. Also, interestingly enough, a lot of the legislation that was used to target the anti-war protesters was related to the laws on fake news, for example, or the laws that were created during the COVID pandemic that targeted misinformation about the pandemic in the first place. But then it was all sort of revamped to target what was called fakes about the war in Ukraine. And
the parallels with what we're doing here are very, very obvious.
That's why I'm saying this, because there are a lot of parallels here, and that's why you hear all the time from Trump himself that he's calling this, like lying press, or the press is the enemy, because again, the press is usually the ones that are actually exposing a lot of the misdeeds, and of course you have to label the press as the enemy, so the press will shut up. And this is something that, again, like fake news, or alternative facts or things like that. This is something that is extremely common in authoritarian regime, because you need to make sure that you maintain control, and the way you maintain control is by maintaining control over the information.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I lost you for a moment.
I'm here.
Okay. So you were talking about the parallels, and the one of the biggest targets over here is education. The media is getting it too. I mean, if you dare just call that body of water the Gulf of Mexico, you can no longer in the White House. But the higher education has come in for an enormous attack. They've changed laws, executive orders, not laws, that are all being challenged in court, but they have had an enormously chilling effect on higher education, on the content of higher education. But they've also relatedly attacked research generally. Is Europe preparing to grab as many science scholars as they can, as the United States loses?
Technically, that's kind of so it's a bit ironic. It's a bit sad though, and ironic in the same breath, because the Netherlands actually announced that they would want to target Dutch scientists who are working in the U.S. In universities and sort of attract them back to the Netherlands. But the funny part is that the Dutch government is actually cutting the funding to our own education here, and we were just on strike this week, where we were actually protesting the fact that the government is cutting our own education. So they are not actually planning to invest more in education. They're planning to invest less, but then again, they also want to attract So it was kind of an empty statement, frankly, because it was just posturing about, let's get those scientists back, and like the excellent sciences. Okay, you kind of already have scientists here that don't get enough funding. So are you going to, attract the Dutch scientists from the U.S. and then make them unemployed here? What's the point? So this is a bit of it was kind of jarring to see.
Yeah.
So, but at least we're still allowed to say, we're still allowed to criticize the government here. So, that's nice, I have to say.
And in where you live, what's the name of that body of water? Is it the Gulf of Mexico?
Oh, thank God not. No, we have the North Sea so far. I haven't heard any renaming bills or anything like that, although I did hear that there's a bill in the Congress about renaming Greenland into Red, White, and Blue Land. That I thought it was a joke.
Is anybody taking Donald Trump's talk about Greenland seriously?
Well, the Danish government certainly is, and I recently talked to a couple of colleagues who work close with the Danish defense, and essentially they're quite anxious about it, actually. And one of my colleagues told me that essentially they spent 5 years developing a plan of defense against Russia, and now they sort of need to turn their cannons, into the other directions because they're essentially expecting an attack from the West. And one of my colleagues also told me that, okay, in my sort of years of studying NATO and, North Atlantic Alliance, I never actually even thought of a possibility of a NATO ally attacking another NATO ally.
It's unthinkable. It's unthinkable.
Yeah, well, exactly. This is something but now it's thinkable. That's the point, right? Because that's not something that even scholars thought about, but now it seems like it's a actual possibility. But I think that the Danish government is probably doing some kind of I hope they're doing some kind of two-track diplomacy and negotiation to make sure that there is at least still military conflicts. Although, again, because they're both NATO members, what exactly is the protocol there? It's not like you can invoke Article 5 because it's not an enemy attack. It's within the alliance. So what do you do? I'm not sure there's protocol for that.
Well, I'm sure Europe would be united by that. And Europe's still a big place. I mean, it has not invested in its military like the United States has, in part because the last century was so hideous. But this one is going to require Europe to stand on its own 2 feet again. And maybe it's time for that. I don't think that's good for the U.S., but I think there's probably time for it.
It probably is, and there's a lot of conversations about that, about creating the coalition of the willing and sort of training its own European army, because some of my colleagues are also actually expecting American troops to be pulling out of Europe. I don't know whether this is an actual distinct possibility. There's a lot of speculations about that, at least. But the thing is that it would take about 10 years probably for Europe to even create a kind of a combat-ready type of army, because that's not the case essentially here. There hasn't never been a need.
No, you have
national.
Everybody has their own national army, and
yeah, but are they combat ready? Not
they might
really.
be, but they're also coordinated through war games that the United States has now said it will no longer cooperate in.
Exactly. So the United States has played a massive role in actually coordinating a lot of the European defense and a lot of the through also American military bases within Europe. So it's unclear who is even going to take command, and I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of discussions. Who is supposed to be commanding all this army, and even within the so-called coalition of the willing, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of infighting and disagreements over who is supposed to lead the whole thing and who would participate and to what extent. So, and again, because in Europe there's a lot of opinions. It's a big. I mean, I know it doesn't look that big from America, but it is a big continent where you have a lot of opinions.
There's nothing in European history that says you guys can agree with each other.
Oh, well, yeah. there's some history of agreement, but most of it's agreement, I'm afraid. Yes.
So let me just ask one more question related to Russia and Ukraine. Trump is telling us that he's going to impose a peace. He said he would have it done in day one. He hasn't. That if he wants Ukraine to capitulate a bunch of its territory in return for an end to hostilities and and he assumes that whatever peace he can impose will be a lasting one without any requirements for security guarantees. Is there any world in which you think he's right and that Putin can be trusted to keep his word?
No. No, I'm sorry, but another thing is that if you take a look at the public opinion polls in Ukraine, you can see that a lot of people they're against even the ceasefire because they're afraid that this ceasefire will only be used by the Russian army to regroup and to attack and take over more Ukrainian territory. No. Because at this point in time, essentially, the Russian constitution says that the entire region of Kherson and Zaporizhia and Donetsk and Luhansk are supposed to belong to Russia. Yeah. And obviously, they haven't taken over the entire regions there. So this oblast, they're not at the official borders of those regions. So essentially, according to the Russian constitution right now, you have this idea of that you're supposed to actually move to the borders of those regions. That's sort of where the war ends. So especially with the current American...
Can I say that differently? So according to the Russian Constitution, Ukraine is illegally occupying Russia right now.
Well, kind of, yes, because that's the point. Because, according to the Russian Constitution, the entire regions are part of Russia right now.
Yeah, that's what Donald Trump thinks Canada is doing to the United States. It's insane.
But I'm afraid that's. You say it's insane, but that's what essentially J.D. Vance and Trump believe in. Because if you listen to their interviews, I don't think they know much about Ukraine in the first place. And even now, that interview with Tucker Carlson, when he asked Putin, "Oh, why didn't you take that land? It's yours anyway." I mean, I'm paraphrasing here, but the point was that, "Oh, it's your land anyway, so why didn't you take it before?" So a lot of the far right in the U.S. actually essentially takes Putin at his word, and he's fake history lessons about that this is actually Russia anyway, so, why bother, in a sense.
Yeah. Well, Lisa, I've been opening my show with the Russian national anthem for the last few weeks because I just think that's whether the American people want it or not, that's where our president is.
Well, one of my colleagues asked me if I could give him some Russian lessons because that he might need it as an American. So yeah. I think it's a step too far, but I do think that there's a remarkable similarity between the way Trump and Putin view the world and the way they also think of their country's great power status that needs to be asserted in a certain way and preferably in a violent way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, Lisa, thank you as always. It's terrific to catch up. Your perspective is really important and helpful.
My pleasure.
Talk to you soon. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
All right, everybody, we're going to take a break. And, oddly, we're going to go to Iowa next. Stay tuned.
You're looking at the big picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Okay, welcome back. And as I promised right before we went to break, Laura Bellin is back with us. She's the publisher of Bleeding Heartland. And for those of you who, remember her times on this show, an unbelievably thorough and determined reporter of Iowa politics. Laura, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Edwin.
I almost don't know where to start because so much bad news has happened. I guess maybe I want to start, excuse me for coughing, with the town hall meetings that are going on in Iowa. Can you talk about those? I understand that even the august Chuck Grassley came in for some rough treatment.
Yeah. So Chuck Grassley has done some open town hall meetings for many years, but he tends to do them only in the smaller, more conservative counties. He hasn't had an open town hall in a major urban county in Iowa for a long time, years. But yesterday, I was not there. I just saw the video and some of the news reporting from it. But he had one of these town halls where normally he would get a small crowd of mostly friendly attendees, and then, well over 150 people showed up. Too many of the capacity of the room. A lot of people were outside protesting. So people are mad and they're showing up. But we have activists all over the state of Iowa organizing empty chair town halls for our members of the U.S. House who really, most of them don't do any in-person town halls. Some of them don't even do the telephone town halls. And it's also relatively rare for Senator Joni Ernst. So I know I was in Davenport on Tuesday, and I heard that local people were organizing an empty chair town hall for Senators Grassley and Ernst, and then their member of the U.S. House, Mariannette Miller Meeks. And this kind of thing is happening. I was in Des Moines about a little more than a week ago now. Minnesota Governor Tim Walz was here hosting an empty chair town hall for our member of Congress, the 3rd District of Iowa, Zach Nunn. He has not ever done a town hall. This isn't a recent thing for him, like the Republican leadership is telling their members not to do town halls. He hasn't done any in any of the 2+ years now that he's been in Congress.
And that's okay with people?
Well, I mean, apparently it is. I mean, these telephone town halls, I don't know that Zach Nunn even does those, but Marinette Miller-Meeks and the 2nd District Representative Ashley Hinson, they do a lot of the telephone town halls where the staff can control the mic and who gets to ask a question. And I should say that Ashley Hinson has said that she's going to continue to do in-person town halls. I'll be really curious to see how many people show up to her next public appearance. What we have in Iowa is our members of Congress tend to travel around and do a lot of events. Many of them are closed-door sessions at private businesses or private. They might do something with a local chamber of commerce or the Rotary, but it's not announced in advance, open to the public, and a venue where people can ask them the questions about whatever's on their mind.
So what were people mad about when they went to Grassley's event?
Well, I think people were really focused on all of the Trump administration's abuses of power. I mean, the illegal refusal to spend money that Congress authorized, the mass firings of people, which seem to be in opposition to federal law in many cases. And it seemed to me, again, I wasn't there. I was just following the news reports and seeing some of the video, that people are just upset that Congress isn't standing up and what are they doing to push back against this overreach? Remember, these congressional Republicans, they said it was an overreach and an abuse of power for Joe Biden to give student loan debt relief. And now we just have a wholesale shutting down of agencies, of programs, canceling contracts that were already signed. Lutheran Services in Iowa has had to lay off staff all over the state because they can't get reimbursed for refugee work that they've already done, that they were under contract to do. So I think it was generally about at the Chuck Grassley town hall, people were just angry about what the Trump administration is doing and why Congress isn't pushing back. But I will say,
I'm so fascinated by that, Laura. I mean, there's polling that tells us that Americans don't care about the democracy, that they're only going to push back when their 401k is bankrupt or they can't get a Social Security check or the price of eggs gets to be like $12 a dozen. It's getting there actually in Chicago, but that's the only thing they care about. And you're telling me people are showing up because they're worried about the abuse of power, about and that's interesting.
Certainly at the Chuck Grassley town hall. Now, I spend this time of year, the Iowa legislature is in session. We just have a part-time legislature, so mostly they're in session from January through early May. And so a lot of my focus has been there. And we've seen some very large protests at the state capitol, and those have been focused primarily not on what the Trump administration is doing, but on what the Republican majorities in Iowa have done, in particular, rolling back civil rights for LGBTQ people. There's been a massive attack, under the guise of going after DEI. It's really just an attack on equality and inclusiveness for anybody who's not straight, white, conservative.
Well, I want to talk to you about that. So let's do that now. So this notion that somehow there were abuses in the correction that DEI was supposed to be, this notion that that the legacy of racism in the United States needs some thought. That the backlash to that has been not against DEI. The backlash to that has been a complete rollback of civil rights. That civil rights should not be an issue for the government, that civil liberties are overvalued in the United States. That's the view of the right wing. And so talk about what happened in law in Iowa this week or last week.
Well, so first of all, on the attack on DEI, this has been going on for a few years. They've been going after DEI in higher education at the state universities in Iowa. So they required that the universities stop spending any money on any DEI staff or programs or offices that were not required by state or federal law. So already a lot of things have been shut down at our state university. So, for example, Iowa State University, which is in Ames, they had an LGBTQ student center that had been going for maybe around 30 years, and that was just closed down, and now it's just a generic computer lab that's open to all students. So they don't want anything. The universities in Iowa already can't do anything that basically supports any underrepresented or marginalized group. But now what the Iowa House, and these bills are not law yet, the Iowa House has approved a number of them. They have passed a number of bills that would make it illegal for city governments, county governments, school districts to have any kind of DEI staff or programming. They passed something that would say that private colleges in Iowa, if they have any DEI staff or programming, that they wouldn't be able to have access to something called the Iowa Tuition Grant, which low-income students use. So in a sense, punishing low-income students who want to attend a private college in Iowa because the legislature doesn't like the politics of the HR policies there. And I mean, the list goes on. So, I mean, that is one whole area that they're working on. But the thing that really brought out the largest numbers, one of the largest protests we've ever seen at the Iowa legislature was a few weeks ago. They passed a bill to remove from our state's Civil Rights Act protections against discrimination on the basis of gender identity. And the bill went farther than that. But the centerpiece of it was to say that transgender and non-binary people in Iowa no longer have any legal protection against discrimination in any area of life, or at least they will not once that law takes effect on July 1st. So that means that it would be legal to evict someone, fire someone, refuse to hire, refuse service to someone, refuse credit to someone, just on the basis of them being transgender or perceived to be transgender. So, I mean, it was really one of the worst stories I've ever covered in my life, and I'm in the 9th year of covering a Republican trifecta, so that's saying something.
I just want to sit with that for a minute. So if you are non-binary, if you've transitioned and you are no longer what you were assigned at birth, the government of the United States says, well, you can't change your birth certificate, and the government in Iowa says we're going to do what we can to tell the country that you don't count as a human being. And so if anybody wants to treat you badly because your humanity doesn't count anymore, that's okay because we can't protect you.
Yeah, and the Iowa law, so Iowa added sexual orientation and gender identity to our civil rights law in 2007. And so that has allowed people to get their birth certificates changed to reflect their new gender identity, to get a new driver's license and so on. For a lot of legal documents, you need to change the birth certificate first. So actually there are legal clinics going on right now in Iowa for people who want to go through this process before July 1st when this law takes effect. But yeah, there will basically be no legal recognition in Iowa for someone's gender identity, only the sex assigned at birth. And that is, in addition to being a huge problem for trans and non-binary people, as somebody pointed out at the public hearing they had on this bill, the mom of an intersex toddler, she said, well, I don't know, what my daughter, when she grows up, she may choose to identify as male, and I won't be able to change any of her documents because she was assigned female at birth, because they only found out when she was over a year old that she has a fairly rare intersex condition. So, but the wording of the law that they passed really is much broader than that. The intention was to open the door to discrimination against trans and non-binary people, but there's a line in the law that literally says separate accommodations are not inherently unequal. And, what they mean is to say that it's okay for the state to have, let's say, a statewide bathroom bill, but that it is not restricted in the wording that they put in that law. It's basically just saying separate but equal can be the law in Iowa as of July 1st. So think about what that means for discrimination on the basis of sex or race or religion or anything else. I mean, the Code of Iowa is going to say that separate accommodations are not inherently unequal, which is just mind-blowing.
Well, they have they want to roll back past Brown v. Board of Education. I think we saw this in the federal government, the Trump administration said that you can have discrimination in accommodations is fine. That if you're a contractor, you can separate people. But I think that saying so doesn't make it so. I think Brown is the law of the land, and separate but equal is illegal and remains illegal unless and until the Supreme Court changes their view of the Constitution.
Well, in the Iowa law, I mean, I do expect there to be lawsuits over this rollback of transgender rights, because there's a U.S. Supreme Court case from 1996 that's called Romer v. Evans that struck down an anti-LGBTQ referendum that passed in Colorado. And the gist of it, of the majority opinion, is that if the state grants civil rights to a group, or if the government grants civil rights, they can't selectively target one group for the rollback, and that is basically what happened in Iowa. So there are real questions about whether this Iowa law is constitutional. But meanwhile, I mean, it's very worrying to me that the state has sent a signal that, if you want to discriminate against somebody on the basis of their gender identity or their perceived gender identity, we're not going to say that's illegal under state law.
When do we get to the point, and I know that the right-wing argument is we've gone too far in identifying all these different kinds of people, that we just all people, and can't we all just be done with questions of race or questions of identity? That's terrible. So when do Republicans pass a law that says you just can't discriminate against anybody?
Well, ironically, that's what they claim they're trying to do with some of the anti-DEI legislation. And in fact,
and then they pass a law that discriminates against somebody.
Right. Well, the Republicans
what they say and what they do are not the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it happens to be an Asian American legislator who ran one of these anti-DEI bills, and he said, we just need to judge everybody by their merit. I mean, part of the problem is that people are talking past each other, because the caricature of DEI that you hear from the Republican politicians is not how any of this really works, right? Like they make it sound like teachers in school are telling kids you're bad if you're white, or you should feel guilty if you're white, and they say that the city governments, if they're doing DEI, that's inherently discriminating against someone, when really it's more about cultural competency is what a lot of DEI programs are about, or in the education setting, just making sure that everybody has a chance to succeed, even people from marginalized backgrounds. But they make it sound like the DEI is just about dividing people, and particularly there's a whole white grievance culture, right? That they claim that all of these DEI policies are somehow harming white people, when there's just no evidence to support that at all. But I mean, that's the caricature that we hear in these legislative debates.
In those debates, and in what we're hearing in Washington and some other states, there is a demand on the right for conformity. But the conformity they seek is impossible, because the conformity is one where they imagine everybody is white and a certain kind of Christian. So you cannot conform and be black. That's just impossible. You cannot do it if you're trans. It's impossible. And that is partly why the Trump administration is erasing whole histories of accomplishment of black and women and trans and anybody who doesn't fit their image. But when you dehumanize large portions of a population, terrible results happen. I mean,
they're erasing history in Iowa as well. The state universities are taking down web pages about even past articles about if it had to do with DEI or diversity programming, or sometimes even an accomplishment of somebody. I mean, we're seeing the website scrubbed because Republicans didn't like that you could do searches on the university website and still pull up some of this content.
Okay, look, I know Iowans are sensible people, and I know they see what's going on, and I can't imagine they like it. Has their hatred of Democrats trapped them so much that they are unwilling to break this fever?
I think it's really hard to say. I mean, the Republicans in most of the battleground legislative races, they were running ads about girls' sports, bathrooms on some of these themes. And so I think that the Republicans can say, well, this is something they campaigned on. They won the election. I mean, there was a candidate who was an educator, a Democratic candidate, and they were running ads against him saying that his allies support kindergarten teachers telling white kids that they're bad because they're white. Of course, that's not happening anywhere. That's not something he supports. And yet that was an ad that they ran, and he lost the election. So I think that they would argue that, and I don't think that those are the issues necessarily that Iowans are voting on. But as you discussed on past times when I've been on your program, the Iowa electorate is largely white people without a college degree, and that is a group that has moved toward the Republican Party all across the country, really in pretty much every state. And so Republicans have the largest majorities in the Iowa legislature right now that they've had in my lifetime.
Yeah.
So they can argue that they have a mandate for what they're doing. Now, I don't know how you can look at what's happening in Iowa and say, why aren't they focusing on the schools that are underfunded, the roads that are in poor condition, the Medicaid reimbursement rate that is poor, that is one reason we have a physician shortage. I mean, I feel like they are, when they focus, there are some bills to try to address the physician shortage, but they're not really getting at some of the core big problems in our state, and instead, they're using divisive rhetoric. Ironically, they say that DEI is divisive, but really they're using the hate campaign against DEI and against trans people to try to score political points. And unfortunately, whether that's the reason they're winning or not, they think that that's one reason they're winning in Iowa.
Yeah. Okay, so they've scored those points. They've now fixed the laws that they hate. So what do they do next when the schools fail, when the hospitals close, when Social Security checks come late or not at all, when the farmers have no markets because we've closed foreign markets to American grain? What do they do next? Whose fault is it then?
That's a really great question. And our state budget is not in good condition right now because the tax cuts, the aggressive income and corporate tax cuts that Republicans have passed have really brought down our revenue. So Iowa is going to have to be dipping into our reserves, what they call the ending balance, to make ends meet next year. And there's the Republicans talk about how this is fine, we're going to do great, our economy's in strong shape, and our revenues are going to rebound. Well, guess what? We could be headed into a global recession because of Trump's tariffs, and I don't think they're ready for that. I don't think they're ready for public schools to be closing. I mean, we're only just starting to see the impact of the school voucher bill that Republicans passed 2 years ago. But I do think in the coming years, we are going to see more school closures, and I don't know what they're going to say about it. I assume they're going to just try to distract and talk about another group, scapegoat some group, because that seems to be the politics that's working for them. So
who's
whether
left?
that's the immigrant caravan I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure. Well, they do talk a lot about immigration. Not that that's an issue that the state legislature really has any authority to do anything about, but I think that's an issue. I mean, I talked to state legislative candidates who were campaigning in small towns in Iowa, and they'd knock on people's doors and say, what issues are important to you? And people would say the wide open southern border. So, I mean, I think that that's a perennial issue that Republicans will be talking about. But I do wonder if the Medicaid cuts that they're talking about in Congress, if anything like that passes, we will see hospitals and nursing homes close in Iowa. And I do wonder who the Republicans are going to blame for that, because up to now, the Republicans in Iowa take credit for everything that's good in the state, and everything that's not going so well, they blame on Joe Biden somehow. But, and over the next coming years, they're going to have to find somebody else, some other excuse for why not everything is perfect here.
Yeah. Well, they can't. Republicans in Washington can't make the budget numbers work. They can't give the tax cuts they want without cutting deeply into, Medicaid and maybe Social Security as well. The Washington Post reported this morning that we could lose 10% of the government's tax revenue. 10%, $500 billion because of the the personnel cuts to the IRS. So that's what they expect.
Surprise me, yeah. Right.
Yeah, that's what they so nothing's going to get funded.
They're just burning everything down. It's not really about saving money. It's just about destroying the capacity of government to do things that they don't like. I mean, the State Department ended $1 million a year in funding for something that was called the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa. This is something that's been going since the 1960s. 3 writers who have gone through that program have won Nobel Prizes afterwards. It was a tiny amount of money for the federal government, and yet closing that summer those writers' internships from people around the world, I mean, that's going to have a profound impact on that program. And, I mean, who benefits from it? It's just they're just tearing things down. And I used to work, I heard part of your previous interview, I used to work for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, covering Russian politics. And, I mean, let's see, I just can't think of any genuine United States interest in shutting down Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, and these other broadcasters. It just
whose interest is it in? Say it. Whose interest is it in?
Well, it's certainly in Russia. I'm sure is very happy about it, and the other dictatorships of the world, Orban in Hungary, I'm sure is very happy about it. So it is just. It's a shame, and I think, as circling back to the first topic you brought up, I think the fact that Congress is just standing there and doing nothing, or at least the Republicans in Congress are not even saying anything about it, I think that's what people are so upset about. But if people's Social Security checks start not arriving on time, then I really do think Republican politicians are going to have a big problem. As long as they can keep it to Medicaid cuts, a lot of people don't realize how deeply they will be affected by Medicaid cuts. They think that's going to happen to somebody else.
Yeah, until they don't have a hospital to go to, right?
That's right. Or
well, Laura, this was very cheery. Very cheery.
Yes, sorry about that.
No, look, I've crossed the line. I do not believe we are living in a democracy at the moment. I think we have lost that. And if all 3 branches of our government don't believe in the rule of law and don't follow it, we don't have one. And I don't think we do. That doesn't mean we won't get it back. But right now, that's not the country we're living in, and it's devastating. So to hear that the folks in Iowa are showing up and saying, hey, wait a minute, we voted for change, but we didn't vote to get rid of the Constitution, and we didn't vote to get rid of separation of powers, I am thrilled to hear it. Thrilled.
Yeah. Well, it's important for people to step up right now. I mean, it's going to be a lot of work to get it back, that's for sure.
For sure. All right, Laura, thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me on, Edwin.
You bet. Take care. All right, everybody, we're going to take a break, and you know what's coming next. Your calls.
Edwin Eisendrath is taking your calls now at 773-763-9278. The Big Picture is on now. WCPT 820.
Okay, Jim, time to kick us off.
Yeah, hi, Edwin. I'm just musing over I don't know what the commissary is in El Salvador prison. Apparently, you can't get any reporters down there. But I wonder if it's more hospitable than the United States is looking like. But anyway, think of South Korea. Take them for an example. They were effective when that politician wouldn't go along with their Supreme Court. So they showed up in big numbers and reversed it. Now, eventually that's going to have to happen in the United States, and soon. Now, pardon to Shoba, the guy up in Minnesota that strangled the poor guy in the street, if he pardons him, you can almost guarantee some huge protests, and then Trump will have the opportunity to, use whatever violence he can, and that should exacerbate it to the point where we got our cards on the table at that point. And
well, the good news is that I believe I'll double check this, but I believe when Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd, he was charged in state court.
So you can't pardon him?
Yeah.
So far he can't. Well, he's thinking it over anyway. He's throwing it out there.
I mean, if you're charged with murder in the state, the president has no power to.
Can anybody stop this cult leader? I mean, he's willing to take
Trump,
the
yes,
down with him.
Absolutely. You and I can stop him, and we have to every day stand up and do what we need to do in order to make that happen. And you know what? We got to pressure Republican legislators. We got to encourage people to go into their districts and raise a ruckus. You know, I mean, again, just think of this. Again, this is reporting from sources inside the IRS that was in the paper either yesterday or today in the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal, for gosh sakes. And it says that 10% of American tax revenues could disappear next year. Now, you think that normal people living in Republican districts are going to put up with paying for the lifestyle of oligarchs who aren't paying their taxes? No, they're going to be furious, and let them try and blame trans people for that. That's not going to work. There's just no place for them to hide.
So you think that there's a way out of this nightmare?
I do. I mean, I personally think you cannot credibly say that America is a full democracy anymore, and I believe that, and it's heartbreaking beyond words. But that does not mean we can't win it back and strengthen it.
But Edwin, at least I'm 75, so at least I enjoyed that much time and freedom, and I demonstrated in the 60s without any compunctions, and I enjoyed freedom, and to see slip away is more than heartbreaking. Anyway, you have a good week. Thank you, Edwin.
Yep, thank you. All right, I misspoke, by the way. It wasn't the Wall Street Journal. It's the Washington Post. And I think I've said that now twice today. I apologize. Paul, you're next.
Well, the reason America, the United States, is not a full democracy anymore is because one branch of government, the Congress, has abdicated and conceded its powers to the executive, which is generally a violation of the presentment clause. All of this is. And when Congress decides it can't do that. In other words, Congress can't just say, oh, go ahead, Mr. Trump, go right ahead, President Trump, go right ahead and do whatever you want. The court has ruled that they can't do that because they have to be accountable to their powers. And so and Congress is accountable to the people. So if
the people will hold them to account.
Yeah.
So, I used to say to my students, I don't blame you for trying, but don't blame me for catching you. But you know what? If you don't, if you don't care, they're going to talk about low expectations. We should expect Congress to do its job. And then there's the appointments clause. I mean, everything Elon Musk is doing is illegal. And at some point, there's going to be a ruling, and it's coming, where some judge is going to say every single act that Doge has done is illegal and must be undone. But by that time, the damage will be too great. It's like saying, it was illegal to drop that bomb. You have to roll it back. Well, I'm sorry. The damage is there.
Right. That's right. There's no putting the toothpaste back in the tube or the heat back into the fission. Okay, so I mean, I think the other thing is this disappearing of people. The most serious thing is people being. I mean, the Fifth Amendment says that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. It doesn't say no citizen. It says no person, and that includes anybody that the federal government and in the 14th Amendment echoes any state government can deprive any person of life. So when Trump disappears these Venezuelan people to El Salvador in violation of a court order. He said, it was an oral. Actually, it wasn't an oral order because the transcript of the oral order is right there. It's immediate. It's still written. But this is the problem. And I think that the people, I did have a professor back at Michigan State who said to me often, well, Richardson, in my experience, eventually America comes to her senses. And maybe we're going to see that with the right wing catching up. But what's problematic here, Edwin, is to take people and put them to another country. I really hope that Donald Trump has a date with the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And we need to have people who are stepping up and be willing to deal with him because this is so serious that the United States, remember, the relocation camps, the Nazi relocation camps were not in Germany. They were in Poland and Austria, so they could deny that they were even existed. And we know what Trump is doing. He's paying this Salvadoran dictator to take the people that he's and then, by the way, the Salvadoran dictator, he needs to have a date with the ICC as well. This is extremely serious. This is as serious as these are war crimes. Because if Trump is calling this a war, he's treating it like a war.
Well, Paul, I agree with that. But there's a friendly amendment I want to offer. I don't want Donald Trump to be convicted by the ICC. I want America to do the job, and I want him convicted here and in the American jail he should have been in instead of the White House. At some point, we have to do our own job.
That's true. But because this involves international
I'm not saying he's not guilty of more crimes, but let's.
Yeah, exactly. I think he's, just because you've been convicted of federal or state crime doesn't mean you are not accountable to the other. He's accountable. He should be accountable in every which way possible. This is America cannot be. This is the bright line that America cannot cross as to become analogous to Nazi Germany. This can't happen in the land of the free and home of the brave. Can't happen here.
Well,
can't happen here.
The atrocities that were committed by the Third Reich are not happening yet here, and may not ever happen here. But the overtaking of democracy has, and we have to win it back. Paul, thank you as always.
The atrocities weren't in Germany. They were, like I'm saying, we don't know.
They were elsewhere.
Those people.
Yeah. And we don't know what's happening. It's a very valid point. Very valid point. Thank you, Paul.
Okay, thanks.
Earl, you're next.
Hey, Edwin, how you doing? Thank you. Good. All right. The reason why I called, I enjoyed the conversation with Paul there. That was, you guys are doing some great opining there. But my question, I have a couple of quick questions for you. One, how long do you think it'll take for DEI to be explicit for black folks and brown people? Right now, they're using DEI for, the sexual thing. But I really don't think it's much of a leap to go from the sexual cultural thing to just downright outright racism. Black folks and brown folks especially be included and to be persecuted and to be singled out and go back to where it was in the 1940s and 50s when I was a young man.
Earl. It's a fair question. What was your second question?
And the other thing is, I can't believe that I have to be so out of touch that have health care be a right and our health care for all. Now, somebody who has the money and wants to pay for extra services, that's another story.
Yep.
But I don't understand why I have to be an outlier when I believe that health care should be, a birthright for citizenship.
Yep.
What do you think?
Okay, so let's take the easier one first, which is healthcare. I don't think America's. I think there should be. I don't believe in private health insurance. I think they rip people off and have raised costs and not done what they should do. I do believe we should have health care for everybody in America. And we have tried several times, and Obama came closer. A lot more people have health care than they ever did. It's never going to be free because it's a very expensive thing to deliver, but we should make it affordable for everybody. But I think it's certainly not on the radar screen for any improvements anytime soon, and it's going to get worse because they're about to cut a whole lot of money from Medicaid and maybe Medicare and maybe Social Security. So it's going to get worse, and hospitals are going to close. Now to your first question. Your first question. Here's what I think. I think that murderer, Chauvin, when he had his knee on George Floyd's neck, he was able to kill George Floyd because he could not look down and see a human being under his knee. His racism was so great that he did not notice that man was a human being and worthy of life. And honestly, I watch what the Trump administration is doing, erasing Jackie Robinson from the walls of the Defense Department, firing the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for no cause other than he's black. And I see racism on display in our government in a way that I barely remember from when I was a child. And I am disgusted by it. And I think this president would love to see us, repeat the kinds of protests we had for George Floyd, and I think he would definitely declare an insurrection act and cause an incredible disaster. I think it's unconscionable, and so the answer to your question is it's already there. They may be using DEI, anti-DEI, to go after lots of groups, but they are certainly using it to go after people of color in America in ways that are beyond cruel and ways that are beneath the dignity of a great nation and totally out of keeping with the direction our democracy has been steadily, if slowly, moving for its full 250 years.
Well, thank you very much, because I felt the same way, and at least I'm glad to hear that other people are aware of where we are, particularly in this country, and that I'm not so much of an outlier as far as
you're not an outlier at all. It is obvious to anyone with eyes that this administration has their collective knee on the neck of everyone in America who looks different than them.
All right, sir. Thank you very much, Edwin. You have a great one.
Bet. And, I'm sorry to say
the rest of the callers have a good weekend. Thank you.
You too, Earl. Penny, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my call. I would like to know why farmers continue to support Donald Trump. I mean, did they not learn from Trump 1.0? Especially Illinois farmers got hurt because Illinois is a big hog producer. China used to buy a lot of our pork. So I don't understand why they continue to support him. And veterans, it just galls me that Cadet Bonespur is cutting the staff at veterans' health facilities. I just don't understand it.
It's not sensible. The brand of Democrats has been tarnished for years. We have fought campaigns, but they have fought for the hearts and minds through Fox News 24/7, 365 days a year, and they have left farmers, they've left a lot of America thinking that Democrats don't share their basic values. Forget policies, just don't share their basic values. And that's very important. And Democrats have to do more to remind America what our values are and what we care about. And I do believe that when we do, people will come home. They will understand that we have far more that we share. But they don't. And the divide is largely over education. and that's been a big issue. But the real damage that the Republicans are doing, economic damage, environmental damage, cultural damage, is going to. I don't believe that Americans support what Donald Trump is doing. Farmers or anybody else. And the polling pretty much shows that they don't support any of it. That doesn't mean they're ready to vote for Democrats, but they don't support what he's doing. And that's good, because we have to build on that every day.
And if I could just piggyback on what Earl said, a large portion of the Republican Party likes to thump the Bible. Well, they need to read it, because I think the Bible says a lot about taking care of the poor. And I'll get off my soapbox now. Thank you.
You bet, Penny. Yes, I believe the Bible says we are all created in the image of God. Not some people are and some people aren't. Yep, you bet, Penny. Okay, Roosevelt.
Double E, thank you for taking my call.
Of course.
I just sent you some stuff about what they're doing, arresting people that are citizens, sending people to El Salvador, even though they're from Venezuela. Was there a deal? In other words, was there an exchange of money between the leader of El Salvador, which I believe he's like a dictator? To me, he's a dictator, the way he conducts himself, the way he runs his country over there. And here, I believe in North Riverside, just a few days ago, there were some arrests. ICE was there. A lady that was there reported it a couple of days ago on a Spanish station. She's seen it. She saw ICE there walking around and arrested people. So what I'm trying to get at is we see it happening now all over the place. Did you see the images of those men in white underwear or shorts with their heads down over there in El Salvador? Did you see that?
I did.
That's a new tech. And did you see that the people that had them like that with black hoods, people that were...
It's disgusting. It makes my... But you know that Donald Trump tweeted about that yesterday. He said that anybody who damaged, the people, he said the thugs and terrorists who are going after Elon and Tesla, I hope they get 20 years in prison in those nice El Salvadoran jails that are so beautiful. He wrote that yesterday.
And you know who's accomplice or is aiding this? None other than Marco Rubio. Because, look, his people came from Cuba, and he's now conducting himself like Castro because he's trying to work out a deal, which is not a deal, because if you don't include the president of Ukraine in these talks, so-called talks, which I believe the stew has been cooked already between Putin and Trump. In other words, the deal has been done before already because all he's going to do is hand over Ukraine. Or look at these talks. I know I'm jumping all over the place, but look at these so-called talks that this conversation that he had over the phone. He made him wait. I mean, Putin made Trump wait 2 hours, and then he's going to concede. I mean, Trump to anything that Putin says. Those are the talks. Period. And again, the president of Ukraine is not even included. So all this is a kabuki theater, as far as I'm concerned, between those two criminals. Let's just call it what it is. Those two criminals. So, we see this thing happening. Did you see the one on the lady, the activist, the Mexican activist, 53 years old, Vizguera? Her last name is Vizguera. In Colorado, she was arrested about a week ago, less than a week ago. Okay, so it's happening. He's targeting people, or Mahmoud Khalil, too, the student, the gentleman from Columbia University. He's targeting people. They got the names of these people that were in these protests, and they're picking them up so that they don't attract any press, so that they don't see, so that Trump doesn't look bad. But he's looking bad anyway, because how can you guarantee the safety of people? Let's just say that they sent Americans over there to Venezuela. How can you guarantee their their safety or the way they are being treated. I blame this on Rubio, too, because Rubio is the one that's given. And did you see his video saying that the arrests are going to continue as far as these students that were in protests? He said that. So
he said more than that. He said they're going to start using video surveillance techniques that scour the internet to look for sympathy to Hamas, and then if they have it, they're going. This has nothing to do with Hamas. This has nothing to do with Israel or the Middle East. What it is the perfection of technology that's going to be used against all of us. It is absolutely what dictators do. And if we think, we don't like the guy in Colombia, so it's okay, we are fools because we're fools. Yep.
Where's our First Amendment, Double E? Where's our freedom of speech? Where's our freedom of the press? That doesn't exist. We have to rely on the outside sources like myself, The Guardian, BBC, British media.
Yeah.
Well,
there's a lot of good journalism going on, thank goodness. The biggest, corporate journalism companies that you and I are used to for most of our lives have been compromised a little bit. But there's a new version of journalism, independent journalism.
You're absolutely right.
But I'm angry with the coverage in the New York Times and in the Washington Post. I think what Bezos has done is appalling, and yet they're really good journalists in those places.
Yeah, I agree with you there. May I mention a couple?
Yep.
David Pacman. I rely partially on David Pacman. Fernando Espuelas, he's a great reporter. He's in Washington. He used to have his own show on the air in Spanish. I used to talk to him. Fernando Espuelas, he's from Uruguay. He's great reporter, great knowledge on history, American history. And so the Marcellus brothers, Midas Touch, and there's another one, David Pacman. These guys are very good at what they do. And like you said, there's a new way of informing ourselves. And thank them a million. And by the way, this is where a lot of these kids got a lot of their information other than TikTok and all this other BS. And hopefully.
That's why I do this show, it's why I do this show, Roosevelt, because we need to get this information out there.
We gotta continue. And by the way, Ocasio-Cortez is doing around. Pay attention to her because she's doing a great job.
She and Bernie. Well, they're not the only ones. Democrats are doing this all over the country now, and thank goodness. Yep.
And I'm glad that they're putting the fire under the Democrats because they got to do more. They got to do more.
Roosevelt, I agree with you. Totally.
Thank you.
Thank you as always. Appreciate it.
You too.
All right, Eduardo, you're going to be the last caller, but you got 2 minutes to do it.
Okay, well, we're going to see some reaction when those special elections come in, but, more details after the election. I'll comment more about that later because I know there's something here in Florida. But Heathrow Airport, I thought that was embarrassing for the English government, especially what happened with 9/11. And now they have the counterterrorism unit leading the investigation. There was a DHS alert about cyber hack pointing the arrow, otherwise known as Russia. That's not surprising. So I wouldn't be surprised if it leads back to Mother Russia.
I wouldn't either. I thought the same thing.
Yeah.
I thought and Russia's been engaged in sabotage all over, and sabotage and assassinations all over Europe. But you know what? They are Donald Trump's best friends, and we're going to sell out NATO because why not? Yeah.
Yeah, we need to have good counterintelligence and not to depend too much on those machineries, too. So we'll see what happens.
That's right. To trust Tulsi Gabbard to do that for us. Yeah, right.
All right, Edwin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank all of you for being with me again another week. I will see you next week. And get ready for April 5th because you got to get ready to go out and protest. We need to raise our voices. Take care. Talk to you next week.